Manage advanced features of ADDS. Learn about advanced ADDS administration tasks, including creating trust relationships, implementing enhanced security administrative environment, ESAE forests, monitoring and troubleshooting ADDS replication, and creating custom ADDS partitions. Learning objectives. After completing this module, you'll be able to identify the purpose, types, and the process of creating trust relationships. Describe the purpose and the process of implementing ESAE forests. Monitor and troubleshoot ADDS replication. Identify the purpose and the process of creating custom ADDS partitions. Prerequisites. To get the best learning experience from this module, you should have knowledge and experience of Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2016. Core networking technologies. Implementing and managing Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS. Scenario. Contoso Ltd. is a financial services company in Seattle with major offices located throughout the world. Most of its compute environment runs on-premises on Windows Server. This includes virtualized workloads on Windows Server 2016 hosts. Contoso's IT staff are migrating Contoso on-premises servers to Windows Server 2025. As part of the migration, Contoso plans to expand into additional sites and use virtualization to help expedite bringing a new site online. The company is also generating larger volumes of data, with plans for even more data in the future. Because of this, the company needs flexible storage options. Finally, Contoso plans to increase the use of virtualization to optimize their computing environment because many physical servers are underutilized. As part of its technology expansion and modernization initiative, Contoso plans to consolidate its existing ADDS environment comprising several isolated ADDS forests, starting with the creation of trust relationships between them. Another major change that's scheduled to take place in the upcoming months is a setup of an ESAE forest. Additionally, to facilitate deployment of a new in-house developed suite of applications, it's necessary to create a custom ADDS partition. As an experienced Windows Server administrator, you're responsible for planning and implementing these changes. Throughout their implementation, you also need to ensure that the environment you manage remains fully operational. This includes monitoring and troubleshooting ADDS replication. Create trust relationships. An ADDS forest represents a security boundary providing secure authentication and authorization for its users, computers, and applications. Sometimes it might be necessary to extend this boundary to include other ADDS domains and forests. This, for example, might result from mergers and acquisitions between organizations or from consolidation initiatives, as is the case with Contoso. What is a trust relationship? ADDS trusts enable access to resources in a multiple domain and multiple forest ADDS environment. In a single domain forest, all users and resources, such as file shares, printers, or applications, share the same domain, so access management is straightforward and readily available. When you have multiple domains or forests, you need trusts to provide users in one domain with secure access to resources in another domain. In a multiple domain ADDS forest, by default, domains form a tree-like structure with a two-way transitive trust relationship between directly adjacent domains. Trust transitivity implies that a path of trust exists between all the ADDS domains in the same forest. Additionally, you can create other types of trusts. The following table describes the main trust types. Trust type, description, direction. Description, external, non-transitive, one-way or two-way. Enable resource access with an individual ADDS domain in another forest. Realm, transitive or non-transitive, one-way or two-way. Establish an authentication path between a Windows Server ADDS domain and a Kerberos version 5 v5 protocol realm that implements by using a directory service other than ADDS. Forest, complete or selective. Transitive, one-way or two-way. Allow two forests to share resources. Shortcut, non-transitive, one-way or two-way. Reduce the time taken to authenticate between two, not directly adjacent domains in the same multiple domain ADDS forest. Note, forest trust relationships provide most flexibility from the authentication standpoint. They're also easier to establish, maintain, and administer than separate trust relationships between external, domain-level trusts and individual domains across the two forests. Create and configure forest trust relationships. If the ADDS environment contains multiple forests, it's possible to set up one-way or two-way trust relationships between any pair of forests. With a one-way forest trust, you can grant users in the trusted forest access to resources in the trusting forest. With a two-way forest trust, it becomes possible to grant users on each side of the trust access to resources in the other forest. When creating a trust, you specify the root domain of each forest. However, because forest trusts are transitive for all domains in each forest, you effectively establish a trust between each pair of domains across both forests. However, unlike trusts between multiple domains in the same forest, forest trusts aren't transitive across multiple forests. Forest trusts can only be created between two forests and can't be implicitly extended to a third forest. This means that if you create a forest trust between Forest 1 and Forest 2, and you create a forest trust between Forest 2 and Forest 3, Forest 1 doesn't implicitly trust Forest 3. Forest trusts are useful in scenarios that involve cross-organization collaboration, mergers and acquisitions, or within a single organization that has more than one forest in which to isolate Active Directory data and services. Forest trusts are also useful for application service providers, for collaborative business extranets, and for organizations that want a solution for administrative autonomy. Before you can implement a forest trust, you need to ensure that DNS name resolution exists between the forests. To implement such name resolution, you can use several different DNS resolution techniques, such as secondary zones, stub zones, or conditional forwarding. Configuring advanced ADDS trust settings. In some cases, you might want to limit the scope of trust relationships to minimize the possibility of unauthorized access to resources in your forest. Several technologies can help you accomplish this goal. SID filtering. By default, when you establish a forest or domain trust, you can enable a domain quarantine, also known as SID filtering. When a user authenticates in a trusted domain, the user presents an authorization request that includes the SID attributes of all groups to which the user belongs. Additionally, the user's authorization request includes the SID history attribute of the user and the user's groups. SID filtering blocks the use of SIDs present in SID history that don't originate from the trusted domain. This prevents a potential exploit that involves tampering with the SID history attribute to gain unauthorized access to resources in the trusted domain. Selective authentication. When you create a forest trust, you can manage the scope of authentication of trusted security principals. There are two modes of authentication for an external or forest trust. Forest-wide authentication, selective authentication. Choosing the forest-wide authentication enables all users in the trusted forest to authenticate for services and access on all computers in the trusting forest. Therefore, it's possible for resource administrators in the trusting forest to grant users from the trusted forest permissions to resources in the local forest. Additionally, all users from a trusted forest are considered authenticated users in the trusting forest. Effectively, any resource that grants permissions to authenticated users becomes accessible by users in the trusted forest. If you choose selective authentication, users in the trusted forest aren't considered authenticated users in the trusting forest. Instead, you have to explicitly designate computers that they are able to authenticate to by granting them the allowed to authenticate permission on those computers. For example, imagine that you have a forest trust with a partner organization's forest. You want to ensure that only users from the partner organization's marketing group can access shared folders on a specific file server. To do so, you can configure selective authentication for the trust relationship and then grant the trusted users the right to authenticate only to that one file server. Note, when using selective authentication, in addition to the right to authenticate, users from the trusted forest still need file system and folder level permissions on the shared folders to access their content. Demonstration. The following video demonstrates how to configure prerequisites for trust relationships. Create a trust relationship. The main steps in the process are 1. Create 2 ADDS forests. Deploy 2 domain controllers, with each one in a separate forest. Make sure that their names don't match. 2. Configure DNS conditional forwarding. Configure DNS conditional forwarding on each ADDS domain controller to provide DNS name resolution across forests. 3. Create a forest trust relationship from the first forest to the second one. Use Active Directory domains and trusts to establish one-way trust relationship from the first forest to the second forest. 4. Create a forest trust relationship from the second forest to the first one. Use Active Directory domains and trusts to establish one-way trust relationship from the second forest to the first forest.
How to configure a forest trust between two separate Active Directory forests on Windows Server 2019. So we start on SEA ADM 1. And what we're doing here is from the Administrative Tools menu, we're opening up the DNS console. And in the DNS console, we're creating a conditional forwarder to the tailwindtraders.net domain that we wish to establish a forest trust with. So 172.16.10.145 is a DNS server that is able to resolve addresses in that domain. We click OK. The next thing we do is we jump across to a domain controller in the Tailwind Traders domain. We open up the DNS console on that domain controller and we configure a conditional forwarder to a domain controller in the contoso.com domain. So we enter contoso.com, we enter the IP address of a domain controller in that domain, which just happens to be SEADC1, and we click OK. So now domain controllers in both forests can actually resolve the address of the others. So still on the domain controller for tailwindtraders.net, we open up the Active Directory Domains and Trusts console. We edit the properties of the tailwindtraders.net domain. And on the Trusts tab, we click the New Trusts button. This opens the New Trusts wizard. We click Next. We enter the name of the forest that we wish to configure a trust for. In this case, contoso.com is the root domain of the contoso.com forest. We click Next. Here we configure what type of trust that we wish to create. We want to create a forest trust, which means that all domains in one forest will trust all domains in the other forest. We click Next. We select the direction of this trust. Now in this case, we wish to configure a bidirectional two-way trust. So we select two-way and we click Next. In terms of sides of trust, we are going to create the trust for both sides from this wizard. If we didn't have the credentials, in this case of the contoso.com domain administrator, as well as the tailwindtraders.net domain administrator, we would need to only do it for this domain. But we have both sets of credentials, so we can create both sides of the trust using this wizard. We click Next. We provide the contoso.com administrator credentials. So we contoso/administrator, and we put in the password, and then we click Next. So now we are configuring the outgoing trust authentication for the local forest. So what we have the option of doing is choosing forest-wide authentication or selective authentication. In this case, we're choosing forest-wide authentication, which means that Windows will now authenticate all users from the contoso.com forest for all resources in the local tailwindtraders.net forest. We click Next. We also have the same option configuring the trust in the other direction. We're choosing again forest-wide authentication, and when we do this, this will allow users from the tailwindtraders.net forest to access resources in the contoso.com forest. We click Next. We verify all of our settings. The trust creation is now complete. We click Next. We confirm the outgoing trust. We click Next. We confirm the ingoing trust. We click Next. It uses the appropriate credentials we've already entered. We click Finish, and the forest trust is now created. In this demonstration, you saw how to configure a bidirectional forest trust between two Active Directory forests in Windows Server 2019.